Birthright Citizenship. Oh boy, this is going to be a fun one in the comment section. Hello, my friends, Tagoar here, and when we were talking about birthright citizenship, which I'm sure is absolutely not a nuclear issue whatsoever, on paper, it is something that sounds like one of the simplest constitutional principles. You're born in the United States, you're a citizen. No forms for you to sign with your little baby hands, there's no panel of officials who are judging your worthiness, just, hello, welcome to the world, here you are, Mr. or Miss, I guess, citizen, welcome. Which is precisely the reason that it has become controversial. Yes, that is right, my friends. Today we are going to be taking a look at the recent legal challenges to birthright citizenship in the United States, which is something that I didn't necessarily anticipate that is what we were going to be tackling here at this point, but with how the world is going in 2026, really, what else did you expect?
What are you doing?
I am playing Raid, Shadow Legends.
Wearing all of your clothing?
Yes, because otherwise I would have less time to play. Raid, Shadow Legends.
Why is this so important to you?
Well, for you who is unfamiliar with the greatest sponsor in YouTube history, Raid Shadow Legends is a popular free-to-play fantasy RPG for PC and mobile devices, where players collect and battle with hundreds of unique champions in turn-based combat to save the world of Teleria from a Dark Lord, which is already awesome, but now you can do it with frickin' Alice in Wonderland. Right now, and for a limited time, you can get Alice herself, Cheshire Cat, Mad Hatter, Knave of Hearts, and of course, the Queen of Hearts to kick some massive butt. Alice herself is a great legendary attack champion who can disrupt enemy abilities, while Cheshire Cat has come back as some kind of attack demon to change strikes and eviscerate your foes. These are 2 of 4 possible legendary champions that you can get access to if you click my link down in the description or scan my QR code and use the following codes. You can use either Get Alice to unlock Alice the Wanderer, or KITTYCUT to unlock Cheshire Cat. There is also the legendary Razzlebar with promo code GOFAST and the legendary champion Turvold with the promo code BIGDAWG. Any of these can be chosen, but remember, you can choose only one, and they're also for new players only. Besides these more constricted choices though, there are other amazing bonuses that you can get if you use my QR code or the link in my description. You can instantly unlock a huge starter pack with legendary Elenaril from the High Elves faction. And once you reach level 15, you can get an amazing epic Tagoar from the Orcs faction, who is an incredible healer and reviver. Look for me under the game name Tagoar with my clan History Boys and join us in this fight.
So you had to do all of that wearing shoes in the shower with socks?
Yes!
Okay.
For those of you that are curious, for the past century or so, the rule has been anchored on the 14th Amendment and reinforced by over a century of case law on the topic. The current consensus is fairly straightforward. If you are born on U.S. soil, you are subject to U.S. law, and being born in a place that is subject to U.S. law is typically enough to grant you citizenship. There are, of course, some exceptions, and we'll leave those alone here for now. But recently, that clarity has been way more murky, especially with the way that the world has been developing, and that is something that is creating quite a lot of problems. Starting in his first term and continuing into his second, President Donald Trump is seeking to redefine what birthright actually is and who it applies to. His approach has shifted from just talking about it in 2018 to being the first president to attend arguments at the court in 2026. So clearly, this is something that Trump is not going to just let go. He argues that when the Constitution says subject to U.S. laws, they really mean that it means people that have more political allegiance or already have lawful status. This might not really seem like that big a deal, but I can assure you, my friends, it definitely is. Because if jurisdiction doesn't just mean you're from or where you're living, it stops being a clear-cut law. A bit more ruling based on vibes, if you will. Who gets to pick what determines affiliation or status? Is it based on other things? Can it be inherited? There are so many questions that come into play with this. And look, at the time that I'm making this, and I know that by the time this video comes out, it might be a little bit late, I understand that, oral arguments are just wrapping up recently at the time that this episode was being written, and we're still waiting on a verdict. So if anything that I say here turns out to be completely wrong or off, I apologize. It's just what is going on here right now. So what it is that I wanted to do here today is I wanted to start off by answering what exactly birthright citizenship is and why it is so important in the United States in 2026 and what exactly is being argued. Because at this point, in 2026, it seems that really people can't even begin to agree on basic definitions. And from that means that no matter what it is that you are arguing, people don't really know what it is that they are standing for or why. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and explain some things. In short, birthright citizenship can be understood simply as the legal framework that surrounds the process of conferring citizenship to those that are born within a country. As you can imagine, this will vary from country to country, but most countries have at least some understanding of how they want to approach this issue. There are, of course, some countries that confer automatic citizenship, like the United States does. There are other countries, like Australia, that allow for children that are born within its borders to be citizens only if one parent is a citizen or resident. Otherwise, they just take on their parents' visa status. So, as you can see, there are different modes in which this can operate. And for anyone who is getting very angry in one direction or the other, they're very rarely looking at the nuance of the situation, just going, oh, well, it should work like this because this is what I believe, and not understanding how anything actually works in the world. So, with that in mind, you may then wonder, well, how is it that we got here? After all, this is the History of Everything podcast, and we talk about the context that leads us to where it is that we are today. I'm sure that for most of us, birthright isn't exactly something that we think about so much, but it does actually have a lot to do with our broader American legal history. But even that is something that draws upon much earlier roots. So, what it is that I'm going to be doing here today is I'm going to be tracing that pretty far back. And I want to specify, because what I'm looking at here right now is American birthright citizenship. I'm largely going to focus on just those cultures that provide a link to American legal understandings, not things that affect other legal standings in other parts of the world. So, we're not necessarily going to be making many comparisons to other places that aren't relevant for the immediate conversation. That is something that I honestly probably need to do on future episodes when I'm talking about birth crises in other countries, because that is, oh Lord, that is a major problem that is going down in a lot of places. Again, there are definitely versions of birthright citizenship in cultures around the globe, but in the interest of time, we're going to have to focus on just a select few. So then, with that, let's go ahead and begin. I know this one was extremely legally dense, but don't worry. It was researched and heavily written by one of my co-researchers and writers, Goose, aka Patrick, or I should say Patrick, aka Goose, who is in fact a lawyer. So you all can't come after me when it is that I say this, because was it legally verbose? Yes. And that's the entire point, because guess what? We're talking legal doctrine. Now, historically, we have two different understandings of citizenship. One that is tied to who you are from, and one that is tied to where you are from. The first one is called jus sanguineus, or the right of blood. And this one is by far the older of the two, something that stretches all the way back to the ancient Mediterranean. The Greeks viewed citizenship, at least in part, as a function of your parentage. For example, the Athenians originally viewed citizenship as fairly restricted rights that were based on direct lineage, and you could only be a citizen if at least one of your parents was also a citizen, which naturally is going to keep the pool of citizens small, but it is able to expand pretty gradually. This process is something that would change in 451 BC with the passage of the Pericles Citizenship Law of 451. That would change the rule to mean that you would need both parents to be citizens for their children to also be citizens. Later, the Romans had a similar structure, in that citizenship could only be conferred to children that were produced from either both parents being with Roman citizenship, or if the father was a citizen and the mother was not. You couldn't really run into a scenario where, oh, the mother was a citizen and perhaps she was kidnapped by some barbarian chief and now his children are going to be citizens that he can use as pawns within the political system. No, Rome was only allowed to do that the other way around. Later, in the Middle Ages, we start to see the first signs of our modern understanding of birthright citizenship, though. While jus sanguineus would grant generational citizenship, a parallel system was going to emerge in the early Middle Ages that tied status to place, to jurisdiction, and the authority of course, individual rulers. This is what we now refer to as jus soli, or the right of the soil. In the medieval period, it was important to clarify then that neither concept existed as something that was a clean, universally applied legal doctrine in the way that modern states would recognize it today. No, nothing like that. So I don't want people to take things as absolutes. Instead, what we see is a gradual blending of the systems through territorial allegiance, inherited status, and formal admission into political communities. To just give an example of what it is that I'm talking about, in medieval England, one of the clearest early developments of a jus soli-like principle could be observed through the concept of allegiance to the crown. British legal historians would trace the roots of English birthright subjecthood to their medieval ancestors' understandings that individuals that were born within a monarch's dominion owed allegiance to that ruler, and in return, they were entitled to his protection. Now, this cannot be said to be citizenship in the modern constitutional sense, but it did establish an early foundational territorial principle where birth within a defined political space would create a legal relationship that was independent of your lineage alone. Over time, this principle would become far more formalized, which is important for our discussion today with English common law. But its medieval origins would mark an early movement towards recognizing birthplace as a determinant of legal status. At the same time, during this same period across much of continental Europe, jus sanguineus remained the more dominant organizing principle, especially within urban environments. Medieval cities would operate semi-autonomously with their own legal identities, and this citizenship that they would have was often treated as inheritable. Late medieval London would provide a useful example of this concept, as individuals could claim citizenship by patrimony, meaning that their status derived directly from their father having previously recognized citizenship. Now, this seems in practice close to the jus sanguineus practice of Greece and Rome, but direct lineage alone was not always sufficient in this context, because after reaching adulthood, individuals were often required to formally affirm their status through oaths of allegiance, whether it was to their city or their ruler, or by enrolling in civic institutions such as guilds, which played an important economic and political role in the day-to-day life of the city. This system of partially parentally based and partially location based citizenship is something that would hinge on active participation and provides us with an interesting look at how the gradual change in the approach to citizenship would evolve in tandem with the political developments of the same time period. On that note, Florence is actually something that offers another strong example of this blended approach and offers a wealth of surviving legal records that we can look at. Florentine law would place significant emphasis on origo, or origin, which would function as a legal and social anchor that would tie an individual to the civic identity of their father, which is not entirely dissimilar from London's approach. This ingrained itself into Florentine culture to the point that it was embedded in property rights, in taxation, in political participation, anything that you can think of. This is what was included. A person's origo would determine their obligations to the city. It would include their eligibility for office, their taxes, their access to protections under the law, all of these different things. In practice, this meant that descent-based citizenship would operate as an extension of individual heredity. At the same time, Florence, though, did not operate exclusively as a closed hereditary system. The city's economic importance and the realities of being, a major trade hub meant that it had to employ several mechanisms for incorporating outsiders into the fabric of the city. You tend to see this in places where trade is very important. For example, citizenship could be acquired after long-term residence, but the process would prove uncertain, as it was neither certain in terms of the outcome that would happen, like if you could actually get citizenship, nor was it uniform in how long it would actually take place to get citizenship, how long it would take where you had to live in the city for it to count as sufficient, or anything else like that. In other cases, individuals were required to demonstrate sustained presence for city life, including economic contribution and involvement in civic institutions, oftentimes over an extended period of years. This activity could include a wide variety of options, from membership in local guilds, the payment of taxes, the establishment of a permanent household within the city, etc., etc. In still other cases, individuals had to apply to the city officials directly. This dual structure is something that provides an important distinction from modern jus soli, because while residents introduced a territorial component to citizenship in Florence, it did not operate on the supposition that birth inside the city's territory would automatically and solely confer status. Instead, the territory served as basically a stage on which individuals could seek recognition over time. Descent remained the more stable and privileged pathway in the long term, encouraging the establishment of not just family networks, but meaningful civic connections to ingrain within Florentine society. Newcomers had to fight for this hereditary recognition, not only for themselves, but also for their descendants. In effect, Florence operated with a system in which descent provided the strongest and most reliable claim to citizenship, while residence offered a secondary conditional pathway that required continual and prolonged civic participation and recognition. The system is emblematic of a broader medieval pattern in which communities would try to maintain continuity while recognizing their increasingly international nature. And so I suppose when it is that we're looking at this, that what distinguishes the medieval period from both the ancient and modern worlds and their views on citizenship is this kind of layered and conditional understanding. Protecting the status of existing citizens while offering paths for new citizens provided a critical balancing act for cities all across Europe. Citizenship, or more accurately, a person's legal right of belonging, was something that was rarely a single unified status. Instead, it was more of a Venn diagram. A person might have overlapping claims on who they were the subject of, to where they lived, what civic institutions they were involved in, and if they were active members of the community in a social sense. Birth could establish a claim, sure, but claims oftentimes required mediation through increasingly complex bureaucracies, hindered in no small part by the political fragmentation of Europe, meaning identity was a continual negotiation rather than a fixed status, especially when you don't necessarily have the concept of nation states yet. It is more based on hereditary monarchies, which is a bit more confusing. The medieval understanding does not necessarily represent a complete break from earlier systems, but rather a difference in scale and structure, perhaps emphasizing that government complexity is at least some indicator of complexity in citizenship approaches in Europe. Roman citizenship, while also rooted in jus sanguinis, would utilize standardized and formal pathways for entrance into the political community, most famously through military service. The awarded Diploma Militaria demonstrates this standardized relationship, providing auxiliary soldiers with a state-issued grant of citizenship after a fixed term of service, validating this relationship with durable physical proof. In this sense, Rome and medieval cities like Florence or London shared a common view that citizenship could be earned through sustained contribution to their new community. The key difference lies in administration and scope. Roman citizenship was granted through a centralized imperial system with consistent rules and documentation that, yes, did evolve over time, while the fragmented political landscape of Europe in the medieval ages all but guaranteed a lack of standardization in anything beyond a regional sense. As we get into the modern era, though, we have to then narrow our focus more to get into just the British Empire, and especially from that, the American colonies. Now, this isn't because we don't want to talk about global understandings of citizenship necessarily, but we have to keep things brief, and we're already going into very old legal doctrine as we are talking about this. So this is something that a lot of people have probably never even thought of in the first place. So, skipping ahead then, with that in mind, by the 1600s, birthright citizenship within the British sphere of influence, that is something that developed through legal concepts of subjecthood, tying citizenship to allegiance to the crown, and forming what would later be recognized as a potential precursor to the modern jus soli framework. Unlike the fragmented and localized systems of the medieval period, this era saw a more coherent, though definitely evolving, doctrine emerging. Individuals that were born within the dominions of the English crown were considered natural-born subjects. They owed their allegiance to the monarch, and they received protection in return. That is the basic idea. And the most significant legal articulation of that exact principle would come in the 1608 decision in the Calvin's case. Now, this case, for anyone who's curious and hasn't heard of this before, because yes, this is actually very important for legal doctrine, this is a case that would arise from a relatively narrow property dispute. It was something very simple. You had an individual by the name of Robert Calvin, who is a child that was born in Scotland after the 1603 union of the English and Scottish crowns under James VI and I, and he inherited lands in England. The legal issue at question was whether or not he, as a Scot, was able to hold property under English law, which hinged on his qualification as a natural-born subject of the English crown. The court would ultimately rule in his favor, holding that birth within the king's allegiance conferred subjecthood, regardless of the specific kingdom in which birth had occurred in the first place. Now, what makes Calvin's case particularly important was its implications on the relationship between birth, allegiance, and legal protection. The judges distinguished between the natural allegiance, which arose at birth and was permanent, and local allegiance, which applied only temporarily to foreigners that were in the king's realm. A person born under the king's protection owed lifelong allegiance, and in return was entitled to that protection. The decision is also something that would address a broader constitutional problem that had been created in the wake of the 1603 union of the English and Scottish crowns. Although they retained, technically speaking, separate legal systems, the courts effectively unified subjecthood by tying it to the monarch personally rather than to any specific territory. This allowed for a degree of uniformity across the entire crown's dominion, mandating equal treatment, technically speaking under law, regardless of whether or not you were in London, Jamaica, or a mid-Atlantic colony of Virginia or something like that. Technically, Technically speaking, I know that there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be like Welsh or Scottish or from one of the Caribbean islands that are going to be like, no. We were not treated equally. And yes, I know that. But technically, under the law, you were supposed to. In practical terms, this reasoning made it easier to export English legal concepts and theories into more developing British holdings, something that would be very significant for the development of future American political understandings. As English colonization went and expanded in the beginning of the decades of the 17th century, this principle would extend directly into the nascent American colonies. Individuals that were born in colonies such as Virginia or Massachusetts Bay were considered natural-born subjects of the crown, despite being born outside of England itself. Colonies were fiercely proud of their status as Englishmen, and rhetoric from the Americans at the outset of the Revolution would emphasize that the colonies were not declaring themselves, at least in the beginning, as Americans with new rights. No, they were reasserting their English rights that already existed rather than adopting a whole new identity. It ensured that colonists retained rights associated with English subjecthood, including property ownership, inheritance, and access to English legal traditions, creating a continuity of government and society, despite the massive geographic distance. However, the application of birthright subjecthood in the colonies was not universal. While just solely theoretically applied to all individuals that were born within the King's Dominion, colonial legal systems oftentimes imposed significant exclusions. You probably know where it is that I'm going with this. Enslaved individuals, though born within British territory, were generally not recognized as subjects in practice, as their legal status was governed by property law rather than any legal doctrine that might protect even non-residents in English courts. Similarly, indigenous populations were often treated as external or semi-sovereign entities, with their relationship to British subjecthood being shaped by varying different treaties, conflicts, and local policy rather than any overall consistent legal doctrine. British frontier politics on the frontier and the resulting cycles of violence would provide one of the most visceral vehicles through which citizenship was later denied to indigenous Americans, preying on colonial fears through sensational accounts and the fear of the other. That is, quite frankly, simply history. In addition to this more standard allegiance-based citizenship, the British legal system would retain elements of jus sanguinis, particularly for children that were born abroad to English parents. Parliamentary statuses would extend subjecthood to individuals that were born outside the King's Dominion if their fathers were English subjects, a practice similar to those found across the continent. This created a dual system in which descent could supplement birthplace as a basis for legal identity. So it is then, my friends, that by the 18th century, the concept of the natural-born subject is something that had been firmly embedded in both the British and colonial legal culture. Colonists would increasingly understand themselves as entitled to the same rights and protections as those born in England, an assumption that was reinforced by legal tradition and colonial governance structures. Colonial assemblies could pass laws, they could enact reforms, and to a limited degree, they could interpret instructions from Whitehall. As stated previously, the colonial self-identification as English created a hardline feeling of being denied basic rights in the wake of the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, and disputes over taxation and representation were oftentimes framed as violations of the rights that were inherent to subjecthood, rather than rejections of the concept itself. At the same time, the imperial structure would introduce practical challenges in maintaining uniform legal standards. Colonial courts and assemblies oftentimes adapted English legal principles to local conditions and norms, which would lead to a patchwork of local variation in the approach to subjecthood and its enforcement. Despite these differences, the underlying doctrine of jus soli would hold to pretty much a central rule. Birth, within the Dominion, served as the primary basis for legal identity. And that brings us to America finally as an independent state. Because following independence in 1776, the United States would inherit the common law concept of subjecthood, as they did for many legal practices following independence. Despite the continuation of an existing system, the new nation faced an immediate challenge of redefining doctrine that mandated a sovereign within the emerging Republican framework. The term citizen replaced subject, yet many of the underlying legal assumptions would persist, particularly that birth within a sovereign territory conferred legal status. Early American courts generally would accept that the common law rule articulated in Calvin's case remained influential, despite the change in governance. At the same time, the absence of a unified federal definition of citizenship would create a degree of national uncertainty, Citizenship was oftentimes understood through a lens that considered state practices, common law understandings inherited by the English system, and now evolving federal understandings of immigration, which would leave a great deal of legal and political ambiguity about who exactly qualified as a citizen by birth in the United States. This is the way that things would work for a while. And in the immediate post revolutionary period, individual states would exercise primary authority over defining what citizenship was, just as they did to many aspects of governance at the time, leading to variations in the application of what you would have for your birthright status. Most states would adopt an approach consistent with common law, recognizing that individuals born within their territory were citizens. However, this was not something that was codified uniformly at the federal level, and the question would persist regarding individuals that were born to foreign parents or recent arrivals, those who, moved around more frequently, or those who were on the frontiers. The Articles of Confederation did very little to resolve these issues, and even after the adoption of the Constitution in 1787, there was really no explicit definition of a citizenship per se, beyond the references to citizens of the United States. And now this omission left courts and lawmakers with the task of interpretation through precedent rather than any clear statutory guidance. As you can expect, that was very quickly going to become an issue. One of the earliest attempts to rectify the citizenship question came in 1790 with the passage of the aptly named Naturalization Act of 1790, though the legislation would focus primarily on the naturalization process rather than on birthright citizenship. The act would establish that white, free persons of good character could become citizens, and it extended citizenship to children that were born abroad to U.S. citizen parents, which would codify it, at least in part, some aspects of jus sanguinis. However, the racial restriction embedded in the law also highlights an important distinction. Citizenship was not understood as universally applicable, with legal recognition being intertwined with prevailing social and political hierarchies. While the act did clarify certain aspects of descent-based citizenship, it did not resolve the broader questions about citizenship status of individuals that were born inside the country to non-citizen parents. And that is something that would persist for quite a while. And that, my friends, brings us to the point that usually when anyone is talking about birthright citizenship, it goes back to this time, the 1860s. The aftermath of the Civil War would leave the United States in a position that forced a change in their approach to citizenship. Large populations of recently freed individuals had their personhood legally restored, or granted in the first place, I guess you could say, but they were often left in limbo in regards to what exactly their classification was. In part, this was due to the conflicting theories on what to do with the recently free population, and in part due to the national lethargy towards the topic as the dust settled from the war and the assassination of Lincoln, so no one really knew exactly what to do. The ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868 would provide the first explicit constitutionally defined understanding of national citizenship, declaring that, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States, end quote. Now remember this language, that right there, that is extremely important for what we're going to be talking about later. The language present in the 14th Amendment would codify a form of jus soli at the federal level, directly overturning the exclusionary outcome of the Dred Scott case. At the same time, the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof introduced a new frontier for interpretation and legal debate. It's not just the first part of the thing that everyone cites, because anytime you have someone talk about this issue, they always say all persons born or naturalized in the United States. Full stop. That's where they end it. It is what comes after that creates the bit of a legal debate and issue. While it clearly included formerly enslaved individuals, its precise scope was something that was left open to interpretation, especially in relation to children of foreign nationals, diplomats, or other non-citizen populations, and that is something that would lay the groundwork for later legal disputes. In the decades following the 14th Amendment, questions about the limits of birthright citizenship became increasingly prominent, especially in the context of immigration, which was becoming more and more of a bigger deal. The status of children born in the United States to non-citizen parents, especially those who were not eligible for naturalization under the existing racial restrictions, would remain contested. Federal legislation such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 would reflect growing efforts to restrict immigration and limit the rights of certain groups, raising questions about whether or not birth within the U.S. territory was sufficient to guarantee citizenship. As it was, by the last decades of the 19th century, the United States would more clearly articulate the doctrine of birthright citizenship, but significant uncertainties still remained. The relationship between territorial birth and parental status, the meaning of jurisdiction, and the legislative boundaries that Congress could exert on citizenship, all of these things were unresolved questions. And these issues set the stage for the landmark case of United States versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898. This is something that would directly address whether or not a child born in the United States to non-citizen parents was entitled to citizenship under the 14th Amendment. And when I go and explain this here, my friends, you need to understand this case has to be understood then as the culmination of centuries of legal development, now brought to the forefront of the American experiment. The basic context of it is that the case arose from a relatively narrow factual dispute. Wong Kim Ark was born in 1873 in San Francisco to parents who were subjects of the Chinese Qing Empire. As such, Kim's parents were legally barred from naturalization under the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and after traveling to China to visit family, he attempted to return to California in 1895, but he was denied entry by customs officials who argued that, well, he wasn't an American citizen, and therefore he could be denied entry under the law. Challenging this denial, Ark's case would provide the first major constitutional case that hinged on the 14th Amendment. The central legal question before the judges ended up being, quite simply, if a person born on American soil to non-citizen parents could be entitled to citizenship under the 14th Amendment, or if congressional limitations, like those in the Chinese Exclusion Act, would supersede that claim. And, in a 6-2 decision, the court would rule in Wong's favor, centering the opinion on both the text of the 14th Amendment and the historical underpinnings of English common law that I went and explained way previously, and that is why I did that in the first place, that this was part of American legal practice. The majority opinion, authored by Justice Horace Gray, would not treat the citizenship clause in the 14th Amendment as a novel creation, instead seeing it as a codification of the existing legal tradition. Gray would trace the principle of birthright status directly to English common law, particularly the doctrine that we mentioned here before, articulated in Calvin's case, where birth within the sovereign's allegiance would confer subjecthood. The court would emphasize that this rule had been consistently recognized in American law and implemented in judicial matters prior to the Civil War and was understood as the baseline definition of citizenship. In one of the most frequently cited passages, the court would state that the amendment, quote, affirms the ancient and fundamental rule of citizenship by birth within the territory, end quote, making clear that the principle was not invented in 1868, but it was now formally embedded into constitutional law. The government's argument in the Ark case sought to narrow the scope of the 14th Amendment by focusing on the phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Federal authorities would contend that children born to foreign nationals, especially subjects of another sovereign, this, falling outside of American jurisdiction, were ineligible for naturalization. This argument would hinge on concerns about allegiance, suggesting that jurisdiction implied not merely obedience to laws, but included political incorporation. The court would reject this interpretation, creating a distinction between diplomatic or military exceptions and the general population, and it held that jurisdiction referred primarily to being subject to U.S. laws and authority, a condition that clearly applied to the American-born children of non-citizens. In doing so, the court would limit exceptions to narrow the categories that could face citizenship restrictions, such as children of foreign diplomats, enemy forces, or, a topic for another day, the children of Native Americans. It's a whole other thing right there. As it was, Justice Gray's opinion would also engage directly with earlier American precedents and legal commentary to reinforce this interpretation. The court would cite cases such as the 1830 case of Inglis versus Trustees of Sailors Snug Harbor, which affirmed the common law rule that birth within the United States conferred citizenship status. By assembling these authorities in their opinion, the court would present a continuous legal lineage from English common law all the way through early American court actions. The approach was intended to demonstrate that the principle of jus soli was not only historically grounded, but consistently applied in both English and American legal systems, stonewalling the government's attempt to try and reinterpret the amendment in a more restrictive manner. As a result, the court's reasoning would establish that territorial birth was the primary determinant of citizenship, with only a limited influence from parental status. By reaffirming a broad jus soli framework, the decision would determine that the 14th Amendment applied to nearly all individuals born within the United States, regardless of their legal status or eligibility for naturalization of their parents. Simultaneously, the court would acknowledge limits to the principle, subject to narrowly defined exceptions that were rooted in longstanding legal doctrine. The Ark case would thus provide the basis from which our contemporary views on birthright citizenship must be viewed through and understood. Yes, I know that was incredibly dense, but that is why everyone is going so crazy about this, that people don't really understand the history of what led to what it is that we have today and why. Following the 1898 Ark decision, the doctrine of birthright citizenship in the United States would enter a period of relative legal stability, at least in its core constitutional definition. The court's ruling would affirm that the 14th Amendment established a broad jus soli framework, under which nearly all individuals born on U.S. soil were citizens at birth, regardless of their parental nationality. This decision effectively closed the most significant open question of the 19th century by rejecting attempts to tie citizenship to the legal status or eligibility of one's parents. In doing so, it established a durable precedent that would guide judicial interpretation well into the 20th century. But despite this clarity, the early 20th century also revealed that there were still more nuances that were left to parse out on the issue. The scope of birthright citizenship was still being shaped by categories of exclusion, especially in relation to indigenous or non-European immigrant populations. While the 14th Amendment would grant citizenship to those subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, many Native Americans were not initially considered to fall within this category due to their affiliation with sovereign tribal nations. This distinction was affirmed in cases such as the 1884 case of Elk versus Wilkins, where the court held that a Native American born within U.S. territory due to the allegiance owed to his tribe was not automatically a citizen. Although this case would predate Wong Kim Ark by over a decade, the issue of indigenous citizenship would continue to demonstrate the pressing need for legislative reform to actually solve this issue. Fast forward a bit of time then, and a legislative response would come on June 2nd, 1924, with the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act. This law would grant U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans born within the territory of the United States, finally extending birthright citizenship to the nearly 250,000 Native Americans that were living in the U.S. at the time. Finally, federal law would provide a clear-cut remedy to this effectively stateless population, and this was a bigger deal than you might actually realize. Native Americans, before this act were passed, had few, if any, ways to get something as mundane as a passport, due to their status as effectively wards of the state. It's important to note here that the act did not eliminate tribal sovereignty or membership, meaning that Native Americans could hold dual citizenship with no issue. Beyond Native American citizenship, the early and mid-20th century didn't really see many direct challenges to the core holdings of the Ark case, and courts would consistently reaffirm that birth within the U.S. generally conferred citizenship. However, the broader legal landscape would continue to evolve through a series of cases addressing the status of newly acquired territories and the rights of individuals that were born outside the continental U.S., but still within the jurisdiction of Washington. These cases are known as insular cases, and beginning around the turn of the 20th century, they emerged in response to American expansion into places like Puerto Rico, Hawaii, the Philippines, etc. These cases introduced a distinction between incorporated territories, which is to say holdings that were considered to be on a path to statehood and fully subject to the Constitution, and unincorporated territories, which generally were under American control but not really on the path to statehood, and thus not totally integrated. This distinction in classification had significant implications for the concept of birthright citizenship. In territories that were considered incorporated, the expectation was that the totality of the Constitution would apply, including the 14th Amendment. However, in the unincorporated territories, the court found that only fundamental constitutional rights applied, leaving the application of other provisions subject to congressional approval. These core rights, the court would argue, covered things like due process, equal protection, personal liberties like habeas corpus, property rights, etc. The rights left to Congress to determine on a case-by-case basis would include stuff about, the courts, like jury trials and grand juries, while other discretionary areas would include taxation. This dichotomy would create a category of individuals who were subject to U.S. authority, but could not necessarily enjoy the totality of citizenship benefits from birth. And really, when we're talking about this, and I've mentioned them here before, Puerto Rico provides a clear example of exactly how this framework operates in a practical sense. Originally designated as an unincorporated territory following its acquisition in 1898 as a concession in the Spanish-American War, residents were not recognized as citizens. Rather, they were U.S. nationals. Effectively, this is something that would subjugate them to U.S. law, but give them only partial rights. It was not until the passage of the Jones-Shaffer Act of 1917 that Congress would grant citizenship to individuals born in Puerto Rico. Even then, this citizenship was based on an act of Congress rather than directly being derived from the auspices of the 14th Amendment, legislatively reinforcing the idea of just solely having a geographic limit. Similar distinctions would apply in other territories where Congress would retain significant control over the extension of citizenship. The insular cases, therefore, cannot be said to overturn the principles that were established in the Ark case, but they did most certainly limit the scope that they applied to them. Within the continental states and the territories, birthright citizenship remained clear and constitutionally supported, but outside of the core territory, especially within the unincorporated territories of the Caribbean and Pacific, citizenship became contingent on legislative action rather than a guarantee of full protection by the Constitution. It was then, my friends, that by the mid-20th century, the doctrine of birthright citizenship, with all of its geographic and indigenous nuance, that was something that was firmly established in the United States. And at this point, there had been nearly half a century of legal and legislative action going all the way back to the 1880s with Elk versus Wilkins case, with immigration being a constant state of evolution and expansion, and further case of complication. Unsurprisingly, all these varying different actions were taken throughout the lens of the Ark case, which could be argued to be the foundational underpinning for American immigration doctrine in the early decades of the 20th century. But, and this is the big thing, the practical implications and applications of that doctrine remained closely tied to broader legal developments, especially in how the 14th Amendment was interpreted. Because birthright citizenship depends not only on the fact of birth within the U.S. territory, but also on the requirement that individuals be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. So it should come as no surprise that as equal protections dominated the political and legal arenas during the civil rights era, the push for equal protections must be seen as at least part of the extension of the same conversations that spurred the birthright debate in the 1890s. As courts and lawmakers would revisit the scope of that phrase in other contexts, especially the equal protection and due process issue, those interpretations would indirectly reinforce the breadth of birthright citizenship, and in effect, the expansion of constitutional protections during the civil rights era and beyond would solidify the idea that nearly all individuals born within the United States fell within the jurisdiction and, therefore, were entitled to citizenship at birth with all the rights and protections that entailed. This connection is something that becomes even clearer when examining how the court would approach the concept of jurisdiction. In the 1982 case, Plyer versus Doe, the court would hold that individuals present in the United States without legal authorization were nonetheless subject to its laws and entitled to certain constitutional protections. And so this, my friends, is the conversation that largely would define American citizenship and immigration policies from the 1980s going all the way up to, say, the late 2000s. Immigration and birthright citizenship might wax and wane depending upon, the political winds at large, but for the most part, the concept of birthright citizenship is something that remains secure in both case law as well as legislation, even if people's feelings changed. But since 2008, we've seen some significant changes, culminating in the first ever appearance of a president at the Supreme Court during arguments. From the administration of Barack Obama through the present, birthright citizenship would remain continuously anchored in the 14th Amendment and its legal precedents. But it has increasingly become the target of political debate, including the focal point of the 2024 election. During the Obama years, the doctrine itself was not directly challenged through federal policy, but it was repeatedly an element of broader cultural and political debates over immigration enforcement and executive authority. Questions surrounding the legal status of undocumented immigrants and their children, especially in relation to programs like DACA, or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, would bring renewed publicity to the distinction between citizenship at birth and legal presence. Because while DACA would address individuals brought to the U.S. as children, many having spent the majority of their lives in the country, it did not fundamentally alter the legal quagmire that these children and young adults found themselves in. The Dreamers, as they were often called, could get temporary protection in 2-year renewable stints. And with these protections, they could work, go to school, drive, and travel, but they remained as largely unincorporated in the eyes of the government. Their status was conditional, renewable, and entirely dependent on executive policy rather than grounded in anything with the Constitution. It is important to note that DACA offers no real pathway towards residence or citizenship, meaning that it offers recipients only a temporary shield, and they have to actually find their own way forward depending on whatever that is. By contrast, individuals that are born in the United States were recognized as citizens at birth under the 14th Amendment, regardless of their parents' immigration status. This distinction is something that is critical, as a person could live in the US for decades. They could attend school, they could work, they could be formally recognized by the federal government through programs like DACA, yet, despite all that, they could still lack citizenship. At the same time, a person that is born within U.S. territory would acquire citizenship immediately and permanently at birth without regard to anything for their residency history, parental status, or subsequent government action. In practical terms, DACA made this boundary significantly more visible. It created a large population of individuals who were deeply integrated into American society, but they remained outside the legal body of citizens. Their presence would highlight the fact that U.S. citizenship is not based on duration of residence or degree of assimilation, as we saw in historic examples, but on specific legal criteria, most importantly, place of birth. Rather than weakening the principle of jus soli, DACA would highlight how rigid this whole thing was. It demonstrated that citizenship in the United States is not something that develops over time through presence or participation, but rather something that is determined at birth and remains largely fixed thereafter. However, that is not to say that challenges have not occurred and cannot occur. The issue became significantly more explicitly politicized during the first Trump administration. In 2018, Trump would publicly raise the possibility of ending birthright citizenship through executive action, arguing that the 14th Amendment had been misinterpreted and that children born to non-citizen parents should not automatically receive citizenship. This position would directly challenge the long-standing interpretation of subject to the jurisdiction thereof, as articulated in the Ark case. And legal scholars and policymakers widely dispute the feasibility of this kind of approach, noting that the Supreme Court's precedent and the constitutional text itself would likely require either a constitutional amendment, which is unlikely for just about any administration nowadays considering how divided things are, or a significant shift in judicial interpretation that would allow for a rewriting of case law. And that is something that potentially has its own massive can of worms. While no executive order was ultimately implemented during his first term, the proposal would mark a significant unsettling of established case law and a significant departure from previous presidencies. Then, following the 2020 election and inauguration of the Biden administration, federal policy would return to a more conventional interpretation of birthright citizenship, reaffirming the existing framework. But the underlying legal questions surrounding said birthright citizenship, that did not disappear, as evidenced by court cases surrounding federal authority around immigration enforcement and asylum policy. These cases continue to center on the concept of jurisdiction, especially in cases involving non-citizens and their children. Courts consistently would apply the reasoning established in Wong Kim Ark that individuals born within the U.S. are citizens regardless of the parental status, with, again, only narrow exceptions, well-established exceptions, existing. At the same time, the Biden administration would operate with an increasingly confrontational legal environment regarding birthright citizenship, and more broadly, immigration in general. Litigation and public debate would continue to relegate the 14th Amendment's jurisdiction clause, particularly in cases involving immigration enforcement and the constitutional rights of non-citizens. While these cases, again, did not directly challenge birthright citizenship, they kept the underlying legal questions in the public conversation. Consistently, during this period, courts would uphold the territorial interpretation of jurisdiction, meaning individuals physically present in the U.S. were subject to its laws, and children born under those conditions met the constitutional requirement for citizenship. While other elements of immigration policy did remain uncertain, the durability of the jus soli principle of birthright citizenship remained solid. The 2024 U.S. presidential election, though, would recenter birthright citizenship as a policy issue within the broader immigration platform as advanced by Donald Trump. In the year and a half since his inauguration, Trump's approach has shifted from largely rhetorical proposals to more structured legal arguments aimed at clauses in the 14th Amendment. The presence of a sitting or former president in a judicial forum, especially in connection with a constitutional issue, is rather unusual, and it really drives home the importance that the Trump administration is putting on reinterpreting this legal framework as part of their broader immigration platform. As I'm sure that many people are already aware, presidential involvement in litigation is typically more indirect, occurring through the Department of Justice or executive agencies. Direct participation or highly visible association with specific constitutional arguments is simply not common. And so in this case, building on positions articulated during his first term, Trump and his legal allies have advanced a more narrow interpretation of subject to the jurisdiction thereof, distinguishing between physical presence and what they define as full political allegiance. Under this framework, individuals born to parents without lawful status or without concrete ties to the U.S. are argued to fall outside of the intended reach of the amendment's jurisdiction clause. Opposing arguments have emphasized the continuity of territorial interpretation as was established in the Ark case, as I've already addressed, and they maintain that jurisdiction has historically been understood as subjection to U.S. laws rather than former political membership. Programs like DACA and the tiered status of incorporated or unincorporated territories also support this, and the tiered system of protections indicates that territorial presence serves as a major factor in the conference of citizenship. Under this reading, individuals born within the United States are subject to its authority at birth and therefore meet the constitutional requirements for citizenship, with again, only narrow and well-established exceptions. This position further holds that any departure from this interpretation would require a significant shift in constitutional doctrine rather than an interpretation through more executive or statutory means. Any departure from this standard would require overturning or substantially reinterpreting a decision that has governed for over a century. Secondly, it would redefine the meaning of subject to the jurisdiction thereof in the 14th Amendment. Courts have consistently interpreted this jurisdiction, as I've already explained, and a narrower reading would shift the standard towards political allegiance or immigration status, fundamentally altering how citizenship is determined at birth. Third, it would replace a clear and admissible rule with a more conditional framework. The current understanding is relatively binary, in which you are either born under U.S. jurisdiction or you are not. Changing this framework to instead focus on parental status or legal presence as a determining factor would likely complicate and bog down an already overtaxed immigration system and, quite frankly, just create more headaches. Now, as I said from the beginning, this video was written in very early April of 2026. In the week or so prior to writing this episode, developments related to birthright citizenship have continued to center on legal challenges rather than the legislative changes. We're currently waiting for the final verdict on the case, which, who knows, by the time it goes out, maybe this whole thing will be done, and maybe you're watching this after the case because you're curious about what the hell anyone was talking about in the first place. But it appears that the courts will likely uphold the constitutionality of birthright citizenship. Recordings released from the court show skepticism from the justices of the administration's arguments, but we really won't know until they actually release their decision, which is expected sometime before June, I guess. But that's really all that we can go on about here in the moment. And this decision, if it changes, oh my God, this would be probably the biggest constitutional change or legal change from the Supreme Court in the past century. Citizenship is tied to things way beyond just voting or travel. Healthcare, education, jobs, so many other aspects of daily life are implicitly tied to your citizenship status. Any major changes here will have a cascading effect towards who knows what exactly. But whatever happens, we'll make sure to talk about it here on the History of Everything and explain how it all went down. Thank you, my friends, for watching. I appreciate you for checking in. Goodbye, my friends. I'll see you all next time. Let me know in the comment section below what we should do next, and goodbye.